Hello, everyone, and welcome to the seminar of our Digital Classicist London series. This is the last seminar of our regular summer series, but fear not, because we will have more London series. Because we will have more seminars during the fall as well. As usual, if you're following this live, feel free to drop us a message and just to say hi, to let us know from where you're listening to us. And you can use the YouTube chat also to ask questions to our speaker, that is today Kylie Thomsen, that is gonna talk about the utilization of structure from motion and RTI to study ancient Egyptian statuary reuse. Kylie is about to finish her PhD at UCLA, and I am absolutely delighted to have her as our last speaker of this summer. So over to you, Kylie.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Valeria. And thank you all for having me here at the Digital Classicist London virtual seminar today. And I'd like to also give a particular thanks to Dr. Gabriel Bedard for inviting me to participate in this summer series. My name is Kylie Thomsen, like was just mentioned, and I'm currently a fourth-year PhD student in Egyptology in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at the University of California, Los Angeles. Quite a mouthful. And like was mentioned, today I'm going to be talking to you about the utilization of structure from motion or photo-based 3D modeling and reflectance transformation imaging to study ancient Egyptian statuary reuse. And I am ready to share screen whenever or however. And so I'll go. Okay, am I all set?
Yes, it's yours.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Okay, so as for my presentation overview, so I'm going to go over a couple different things today. So first, my research objectives, and these are quite broad right now. Two, we'll dive into my case study of statuary reuse. Three, we'll go over the methods. Four, the preliminary results. And finally, I'd like to open the floor to a discussion about future research, because again, I think there's a lot of different possibilities. So now back to ancient Egyptian statuary reuse. So the study of ancient Egyptian statuary reuse, this is one of the major research topics related to my dissertation work. And so this is what got me interested in this. I am interested in ancient Egyptian statuary broadly, more specifically statuary created during the late Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate period. And while the reuse of statuary was not an uncommon practice in the ancient world, and this is also true for architecture and tombs and other things in the ancient world as well. It's not just statues being reused, coffins. But depending on the extent to which the object was modified, it remains difficult to systematically study. This is especially true for reused objects which were not also reinscribed. This is one of the main ways that we detect reuse. We see a new name carved into the object, or a new name added to a tomb or to a coffin or something like this. But that's not the only way that these objects were reworked or reappropriated. So while art historians have identified the practices of object reinscribing and reworking in a variety of different media, my case study aims to employ digital methodologies such as photogrammetry and reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI, in order to further systematize and characterize the degree of reuse in a given statue or corpus of statues. Now, this project is ongoing and in its early phases. And like most people, my research has been delayed over the past year and a half, of course, due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So with that in mind, I have had several different components of this project be postponed just in the last few months even. So it's definitely narrowed down the parameters of this current presentation. However, I'm very fortunate for the research I was able to get completed, just in the past 2 years with everything else going on. But I'll be discussing a sort of ideal case study of ancient Egyptian statuary reuse to serve as a sort of model reuse case type, where traditional art historical observation will be coupled with the results of my digital studies in the hopes to better assess the ancient stone reworking. Okay, so onto my research objectives. So broadly speaking, and again, these are very broad terms because there's so many different facets that these objectives can take on. So, but first, to identify and differentiate tool marks, polishing, inscriptions, and other marks on the statuary that are indicative of reworking. This, for example, could include things like reworking of the facial features of the object, adding a new inscription, or reworking previous text on the statue. So it's not just adding a brand new inscription. It's in fact taking over a previous person's name, carving it out and adding your own. Next, to characterize and describe the processes and decision-making involved with statuary reuse. Now, this is really important and what I'm most interested in. Oftentimes, when we're talking about reuse of statuary, we are looking to reassign the object to whatever, be it a king, whatever king initially had it commissioned. So if it was reworked by, let's say, King Horemheb, this is one of the kings of ancient Egypt that is known for usurping or reusing statues in ancient Egypt. But we want to find out, who did he take it from? So we look at different art historical indicators, styles that help us give the appropriate initial date of the object. But what I'd like to do with the methods that I'm employing today is take that back. So once we've now identified who it initially belonged to, or at least narrowed it down, I'd like to go back to when the object's being reworked, and what was most important to rework, to change, to make it functional for the individual who it now was supposed to be able to embody. And finally, to utilize the analysis of statuary reuse to further illuminate the social, economic, and political situation of the context in which it occurs. And again, this is one of the important things to keep in mind, that reuse is going to be very context specific. It's going to be varying case by case. So we're not going to have any blanket answers to statuary reuse. We have to take into account its context. All right. Now, just in case anyone needs a little background on ancient Egyptian statuary in general, before we dive into this very specific case study, I just would like to give this quick synopsis for those who are less familiar with the topic. So in ancient Egypt, statuary embodied ancient Egyptian cultural and ideological beliefs, and its primary function was that of being inhabited by what it represented. Usually you might think of, a depiction of the king, but also it could be an official or a deity, and it's meant to be, representing this person in perpetuity. Characteristics such as its form and its material illuminate the ideological concepts that informed its creation. So the stone it's made out of is very important, which we can't get into for the purposes of this presentation. The pose in which it's depicted in is important to understand the action it's supposed to be undergoing, etc. But the ancient Egyptians created an array of different sculpture types in a variety of sizes and materials, ranging from a colossal statue of the king to small figurines, right? So there's a definite variety of statuary types in ancient Egypt. And it would be I should mention also that when I say ancient Egypt, I'm talking about a time frame of about 5,000 years. So you must imagine also that, statuary is not static, and it's, undergoing changes all the time. So the images that I have on the screen, on the farthest left, is the so-called unfinished obelisk. And I understand it's not the statue type that we're talking about today, but located in the Aswan granite quarry. So this is one of our quarries from ancient Egypt. It was commissioned by New Kingdom ruler Hatshepsut. And I use this image just to illustrate that, to show both a quarry, obviously this is a modern photo, but to show that it's being carved out directly from the bedrock. Then in the center image, this is a relief from the tomb of Rekhmire, which is a vizier, or who was a vizier under Tutmosis III, showing or depicting in this tomb scene the subsequent process of finishing the stone, where you do things such as polish it or inscribe it or carve out specific features of the statue itself. And then finally, the statue is going to end up in a particular context, be it a mortuary or funerary setting, or a temple. The life history of these objects is not always straightforward. Oftentimes they're moved, and obviously, such as the topic of today, they're reworked, usurped, etc. But this is sort of just a general overview of the kind of life history that we might expect for an ancient Egyptian statue. Okay. Now, how do we study reuse itself? So, and especially in ancient Egypt. Reuse studies in the ancient world have become much more topical as of late. In Egyptology in particular, Professor Karakuni, who is also my advisor, is perhaps best known in our field for pioneering the study of late Bronze Age coffin reuse, where she investigates the socioeconomic and political turmoil of the time period, which ultimately affected funerary and burial practices in ancient Egypt. So in the case of the late Bronze Age collapse, we're seeing coffins being reused, and this is certainly economically driven, as well as ideologically driven, right? Because in ancient Egypt, you needed a coffin. And for it to function, it just required certain elements. And, at some point, it was okay to reuse a coffin to serve, its function for you. But we know that reuse is not only economically driven, but it can also be political. And this image right here is just from one of Karakuni's articles, Coffin Reuse, Ritual Materialism in the Context of Scarcity. Here, note that there's a blank name for name reuse on the coffin. So now to give an example of statuary reuse in ancient Egypt before we dive into the case study. But this is a way in which we can study reuse. That might be politically driven, more so than even economically. So the Colossus pictured above is a statue usually identified as Ramses II, but recently has been re-identified by stylistic elements as either Amenemhat II or Senwosret II, who are both kings of the Middle Kingdom, so hundreds of years prior, which had New Kingdom reuses by both, and at least both, Ramses II and Merneptah. In this statue, so what you're seeing right now, the king is represented here seated, wearing the Nemes headcloth. So that's the headcloth he wears right there. There's the uraeus. And a kilt fastened by a girdle around his waist. In his right fist, which is now, it's been broken, he would be holding a cloth, which is one of, it's an accoutrement of, the high status ancient Egyptians. It's just one of these motifs we often see, while the left hand lies flat on his thigh. So the life history of this particular object, as has just very briefly been explained, is quite complex. Not only was it reworked and reinscribed, and we'll look a little more at that in just a minute, but it's also been moved several times. It was transported to several different locations, including Pyramses and Tanis, and we assume that it most likely initially originated from a temple in the Memphite area. So when you look at this statue, we're going to look at a couple of different things really quick. So you might not notice anything at all right off the bat if you're just taking, an initial glance at it, or if you're not an Egyptologist specifically. But what we can start to see are a bunch of different things having been reused. So I'll actually start on the back. So, and actually just throughout the object, the inscriptions on the back of the statue were added 600 years after the Colossus was initially created. You can see the cartouche of Ramses II, Usar Ma'at Ra Setapen Ra, where he not only reinscribed the object on the back and on the sides, and elsewhere, but he also had the face reworked as well. So we can see with a close inspection, just with the naked eye, right, just doing a usual art historical analysis without the aid of these digital methodologies, which we're going to talk about shortly, you can see that the mouth has been changed, it's been reworked. These lines were added as well. Also, the headband has been lowered for the Nemes crown. The eyes have been changed, the inner canthus and the inserted line. One of the ears has been made smaller. There was an added broad collar, so this decoration here was not initially there. In addition, we get an added pectoral, which has the name of Ramses II. And then an additional one is added by Merneptah. So we just have a lot going on here, right? So with all of that in mind, what we can just see when we're generally studying an ancient Egyptian reused statue, let's now look at this statue of Amenhotep II recarved for Ramses II. This piece is currently at the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. Its accession number is 1982, the year it was acquired, and then 0.04. It was initially excavated in 1896 and attributed to Ramses II. I'll talk more about that in a second. But then in 1999, Sarusian re-identifies this in an article as Amenhotep II based on a couple of different things. The object is 102.8 centimeters high, 45.7 meters wide, and has a thickness of 38.1 centimeters. In its excavation in 1986, before I go on, I'd actually like to quickly bring up, I'd like to talk about time and space, since we've been, jumping around a lot. But when I talk about Amenhotep II, we're talking about the mid-18th dynasty, around 1424 BCE to 1398. And then Ramses II is a 19th dynasty king, reigning from about 1266 BCE to 1200. So this is just so we know where we are in time. And then in space, when I was bringing up Memphis, we were talking about up here in Lower Egypt, and then Thebes, which is where our current case study object was excavated at in the Karnak Temple precinct, is down here in Upper Egypt. It was excavated by Miss Margaret Benson in 1986 in the second court of the Temple of Mut in Karnak. So note here, this is the map that was created of the Temple of Mut, found here. And this is the state in which the object was found. So note a couple different things. We're missing much of the object's left shoulder and the entire base of the object. So when it was initially found, this base was connected, but it was so damaged by, the water table and by corrosion from salt that even though they tried to very carefully excavate it out, unfortunately, immediately the lower half of this statue crumbled away. But this was not before on the seat of the object. So it's a seated statue. The cartouche of Ramses II was identified. and therefore you can see when it was published, initially published, it was identified as Ramses II. But like was mentioned before, Sarusian was able to re-identify that object, and we're going to talk about the reasons for which as we go through our method. So I'll briefly now introduce our methodology. So first, we're going to talk about photogrammetry. Photogrammetry is often used by art historians, by archaeologists, etc., in the field anymore. And it's because it's a very cost-effective way to record a site or record an object, right? Because all we need is a camera. It would be best to have targets like are here, and a tripod to make sure that your camera is stable. So in the case of our case study here, photos being taken at a museum, of course, we have so much more control than one might have if trying to do photogrammetry in the field. Because photogrammetry just requires a set of overlapping photos. Ideally, you'd like about 60% overlap. In order for a stitching software, a 3D modeling stitching software, which I used, Agisoft Metashape, can stitch the photos together to create a 3D model. And like I mentioned, these targets here, there are these coded targets that can be placed in the scene before photos are taken, and then can be used specifically, in this case in Metashape, you have to have the professional version in order to do this, as reference points for a coordinate system. So that way you can scale the object. You essentially insert some measurements, and we'll go over that shortly. So once you go around and you take all of the photos that you need to completely cover the entirety of the object. And in this case, we used for the photos a tripod, obviously, to keep it stable. But as was noted, as you could see in the previous image, the object is quite tall as well. So we used a large step ladder provided by the museum, and then mounted the tripod on top of that step ladder to get photos of the top of the crown. This was challenging for a couple of different reasons, which I'll go over shortly when we're looking at the model itself. So again, once you have your photos taken and you input these photos that you've just taken, the raw photos, into Adobe Lightroom, or this is probably the most accessible of one of these processing systems that can take a raw image, and then you can adjust things like the exposure and the white balance, and then you export those and put them into something like Metashape or Reality Capture. And then once you've created your mesh, you can import it into something like MeshLab, which MeshLab is an open source system for processing and editing 3D meshes. And in this program, you can edit, clean, heal, inspect, texturize, etc., your mesh, depending on your research question and why you've created the model. So in my case, I didn't want to do anything other than just to run the model and create it, because to study reuse, if we start cleaning up the model and smooth out our mesh, we're going to lose really valuable data. So on the left, you can see I took 153 photographs shot in RAW at sort of these three different main points on the object. So we sort of have this center point. You have this lower band where you face up towards the object to be sure that you're capturing all of the detail of the object. And then from the top, you sort of shoot down here, right? In this case, note the top of the white crown. So this is what I had mentioned before. You can see that there seems to be some extra geometry up here. And that's because if you remember from our very first picture of the photogrammetry slide, the museum itself, they were able to turn off the lights for us to create more consistent lighting. Think just a usual overcast type lighting. You want diffuse lighting on the object so that nothing is significantly more lit than another part of the object. However, because of this, we had some reflections coming up from the ceiling it had this blue tint, which reflected back onto the top of the object. Red granite, which the object is made out of, has these inclusions, which are reflective. Both the black and the white inclusions are quite reflective, and it took on this blue hue. So these are some of the challenges you can run into when doing photogrammetry on the object. You have to think about what the material of the object is and how you will sort of account for any of the challenges related to its material. In some cases, if it's very reflective, you can use a polarizing filter, things like this. But we didn't use that in this for this particular case study because it was something we couldn't account for right off the bat. We had one day also to do the project as well. So once these were imported into Photoscan, you'll note that the targets were then detected. And then here, once they're detected by the software, you can input measurements from target to target here. And note, like is mentioned in the abstract of the talk today, which you can see here on YouTube on the description below, there is a 0.001 millimeter of accuracy. So this is really, really accurate, right? And if you don't have access to Metashape Pro, because it's quite expensive, if you're using the standard version, you won't be able to use targets, but there are other ways to account for adding in measurements after the fact. You can do this by taking your own measurements on the object, and then once it's imported to a software like MeshLab, you can sort of do some equations in order to get a relative measurement out of the object. So now when the mesh is actually being created, when you're initially importing those photos, when they're first in the software, the photos have to be aligned. In this case, the aligned photos, which you saw previously, were used to create this point cloud, which had over 65,000 points. This was then converted into a 3D mesh, which has over 3 million polygons. So I ran it to be very high quality because, again, with my research questions looking for reuse, I wanted to be sure to capture the most data that I could. And then finally, a texture map is generated, which reflects the current state of the object. So this is what you see here, the point cloud, the subsequent, this is a dense cloud. It almost looks like the mesh because it was so accurate. Here's the mesh. This is what I find most useful, is looking at the mesh without the final texture. So this is the current state of the object. And note, similar to the photos, we even run into some issues with the texture here. It tends to sort of blend a lot of the shallow relief on the object, for example, around the eye, around the mouth, which you can more clearly see, at least in some cases here in a mesh. And then again, just pointing out the accuracy of a model like this. Now, moving on to RTI before we look at the preliminary results from these methods. So RTI, or polynomial texture mapping, is a technique of imaging under varying, where you take essentially photos of the object under varying lighting conditions, and then it will reveal surface phenomena. So in my case, I was looking at just the general ways in which the object was inscribed and the areas where it was reused. Here is just more in-depth information about how RTI works. So essentially, these RTI images, so you ultimately end up with this just single image. It's derived from all of those photographs, and the object must remain stationary. The camera must remain stationary. And in each one of these photos, you're getting essentially a different light path. So ultimately, you end up with this two-dimensional, or resembling a two-dimensional image. However, the reflectance transformation, or the RTI viewer, the image is able to know how the light will reflect off the subject. And we'll look at that in just a moment. So here is just figures showing how that works, where the light bounces off, and how you're able to view it. The equipment needed, similar to photogrammetry, I used a Nikon D610, and the same lens was used, a tripod. But in this case, you need a reflective sphere. This is how the software is able to track the light path. And the software used, again, was Adobe Lightroom. And then in this case, free software, RTI Builder and RTI Viewer to both build and then view the RTI image. Previous studies have been done with RTI on Statuary to identify and differentiate tool marks. For example, Anna Sorota's 2014 article, she was able to do RTI on a Middle Kingdom statue, this block statue of Menhotep, which is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, shown here in her figure 3. You can see she has a scale here of 5 millimeters. The tool marks from the wig here, and then here's our close-up, differ from the tool that was used for the text inscription. So you can definitely differentiate between tool marks. Now, whether that's indicative of reuse, that is going to be context-specific and object-specific. In some cases, it could just be one person is carving out the features of the statue, like the facial features and the wig, etc., and a scribe is carving out, or a different scribe is carving out the text. But in our case, we had a couple of really interesting results doing RTI on this object on the front, I just say like our recto and verso side of the object, in addition to the 3D modeling. But we'll talk about the photogrammetry first. So you can see here just how useful using photogrammetry is, especially with a stone like granite. You can study the mesh of the object without the pattern of the stone, which in some cases can interfere. So on the left, this is an image that we've already seen of just the mesh of the object. But on the right, these are images taken from when the statue was, or the statue mesh was inputted into MeshLab, and a filter was used, which sort of detected where a certain different depths of the carving of the object, just to put it quite plainly. You can see the little dowel holes on the mouth, which is, again, one of these indicators of reuse and recarving, around the eye, a little bit around the band. It's just showing this is just general carving. But something interesting of note here is the chin. And it might seem sort of silly, right? It sort of looks like a double chin right here. But when something like this is indicative of when the mouth area was being reworked, it seems that the chin was obviously reworked as well, to fit the style of Ramses II. Because your object, this object here, if it was initially commissioned for Amenhotep II, and you'll see here, he's wearing a Hebsed gown. This is a Jubilee gown for the king. It's essentially this festival that takes place ideally 30 years after a king's reign, where he's meant to rejuvenate himself, right? And it was set up in the Karnak precinct for that reason, for Amenhotep II. Now, when Ramses II reuses it, he's keeping the garment, he's keeping the regalia. This is a crook and a flail. He's changing elements like the face in order to communicate to those, who pass the statue, who are accessing the statue, that, this is sort of the typical face that you'll see for Ramses II, his idealized portrait. Now, idealized is the key term here, right? It's just an idealized image, not an actual image of the king. But once they sort of cleaned up the mouth and the chin, they didn't take it all the way back to the neck, right? So an interesting choice. Something that ended up being a failure for the photogrammetry, but was interesting for the RTI, is this back pillar. So I'm not sure, we'll look at an actual photo of the back pillar in just a moment, but it's essentially completely destroyed and almost nothing can be seen of it. And I was hoping that a filter that identifies more clearly varying depths of the object might help us with the inscriptions here. So this is, I just wanted to also point out, sometimes you have what you think is a great idea for measuring something like reuse or reworking, and it doesn't go as planned. However, moving on to the RTI, so we get several interesting things here. Something that I noticed when visiting the object in person, and this is why I say a lot of this is, again, it has to be coupled with an art historical perspective as well. seemed to be a variation in the polishing around the uraeus. Didn't seem super consistent. However, again, because of the object's context, it was hard to discern whether this was just due to, just general object corrosion, or if this was intentionally redone, like as was done around the eyes and around the mouth and around the chin. When put through, when viewed in the RTI viewer after doing RTI on this photo, and ideally you would take 48 photos of the object, because you're operating at different points. Again, remember, we need varying light sources, raking light, in order to illuminate these features. You imagine that you've got an umbrella stemming from your camera lens, right? So it starts like closer to the lens and then moves out to the, closer to the outside of the object at 12 different points, like a clock, and then at 3 different points in your clock. So if you have, at position 2, let's say, you'll have, position 1, 2, and 3, or 4. Apologies, 4, to get 48 photos. And there you will have, again, this variation of different light sources. In certain cases, you're going to find that photos are overexposed, or a flash didn't go off, or something like this, which happened in my case. I had to delete several photos where the focus didn't go off correctly. It wasn't properly focused. And in some cases, the photo was too overexposed that even trying to edit the photos to all be at a consistent exposure, it still wouldn't actually reveal any data. And so I ended up only running 40 photos in this model. Now, for me, I find that RTI works best when you have 2 individuals working. Someone needs to hold a remote flash or another sort of light source for the raking light while someone is actually taking the photos, especially when you have an object this big where somebody has to stand on a ladder and somebody has to take a photo. But note, in our sort of, we can call it the 11 o'clock position here, when the raking light comes from the objects, our top left, essentially, right? That something is happening around the uraeus. You can see that it's showing the texture here. It's at a lower depth than the rest of the crown. And the light has raked over it and created this. The filter, or the way in which this image on the right is viewed, is this specular enhancement, which really helps, as you can see, you more accurately assess the object's current surface. So here, I think there is reason to believe that the uraeus was also reused, or reworked, pardon. And that part was taken away and it was reshaped, which was really interesting. And then there's just a red circle in case you couldn't see it. Additionally, we got a lot of really interesting information from the back pillar. So this is what I had mentioned before. And again, if you're looking at this photo on the right, it's useful because you can see the lighting conditions of the museum. There's a lot of natural lighting. And like I mentioned, we just had a day to work on the object itself. The sun came out in Texas in the afternoon, and it began to become much brighter. So we're already getting a difference in the exposure of the ambient light exposure, and that had to be accounted for. But you can see, as you just look at the back pillar here, you can't really distinguish much. You can sort of see the text register, right? These lines here, but almost nothing else if you're just viewing it when you're in the gallery with no raking light or anything like this. Now, the image on the right is done, is our RTI image using specular enhancement so that you can see a couple of different things here. You can see, and I'll show you some examples. We have hieroglyphic inscriptions here. It's a Nisubiti, Neb Tawi, and then something else is here, really hard to discern. Now, usually what you would see after these initial signs, it's just identifying information of the king. You've got, your king, Lord of the Two Lands. That was the Egyptian that we were just talking about. And then you would likely, somewhere around here, you would get the throne name of the king. So Amenhotep II's throne name is Aa Heperu Ra. and the cartouche looks like so. Ramses II's throne name is Usur Ma'at Ra Setep En Ra, and it also looks like so. Usually when Ramses II was reinscribing objects, just like he has done here. So this is actually another statue of Amenhotep II, usurped by Ramses II, housed at the Museo Egizio of Turin, category or inventory number 1381. He has also done similar things to what's been done to the object we've just been looking at, but we have clear evidence of the reinscribing of the object, right? It's sort of difficult to tell, but you can see where there is different polishing, where there seems to be inconsistencies in the stone. So here, this is what we were seeing on the back pillar in the RTI image. So these signs here, and then that's why I said we will probably expect a cartouche, and then a son of Ra name, and then more text, which unfortunately, as you saw from the previous photo, does not seem to be distinguishable at the moment. But you can see close up, for example, in the kilt here in this text band, it just gets really, really jumbled here. The cartouche is at a much lower depth. And what I would be interested to find out, and this is one of the objects that would be really ideal for doing some methods testing, like was done on our case study from the Kimball Art Museum here today, is if we could do some RTI to sort of better understand the ways in which cartouche recarving will show up, and same with photogrammetry. The face was also reworked, but this is an overall different sort of image of the king. We've got a different crown, a different uraeus, we've got a beard, all sort of skewing some of the things that we looked at in our case study statue. So now that we're towards the end of the talk, and I've just brought up a lot of information, and these preliminary results are still a bit open-ended because it was very recent research. It was another one of these trips that had been postponed, but luckily I was able to visit before our lecture today. But there's a bunch of different potential avenues. So first being my favorite part is, of course, what we saw in the RTI around the reworking of the uraeus. So doing more comparative uraei research to statues dating to Amenhotep II or around Amenhotep II, and comparing them to more reused Ramses statues, and sort of perhaps try to characterize when a uraeus needs to be reworked to fit the 19th dynasty style, for example. There are things like this to consider. In addition to the facial features, again, note what I mentioned about the chin, how it was reworked, because this 18th dynasty face is a little broader, and it's cut in a bit here at the chin to fit that 19th dynasty style. Working with epigraphers or an epigrapher on the back pillar, the RTI image of the back pillar, to perhaps get a better understanding of what text, even though we know generally what type of text will be in the back, but just to make a more accurate characterization of the back pillar would be really useful. And that's all just for this object. Now, thinking about how to use these methods on different types of statues that have different types of reuse, I think that the opportunities are limitless, and it all depends on your research question and what specifically you're looking for. I myself am particularly interested in pieces that don't have obvious signs of reuse and require a more meticulous study that is very dependent on not only your traditional art historical analysis, in-person analysis, but also our digital methods that were presented today. I'd like to give acknowledgments to Jennifer Price and Peter van der Moertel from the Kimball Art Museum, who were incredibly helpful during our quick day visit and during a pandemic. I can't thank them enough for their accommodating us. My advisor, Professor Kara Cooney, my husband, Mate Tikindalian, who is also my research assistant in this project. Like I mentioned before, it definitely requires two people in some cases. And finally, a special thank you to Dr. Gabrielle Bedard and Digital Classicist London. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Kelly. That was really an exciting case study. I would have quite a lot of questions, and spanning from digital to Egyptology. While we give our friends in the audience a little bit of time to type their questions, I will start with one.
Okay.
I really liked your talk. I found it very interesting. And one of the things that I appreciated was how really practical it was, and how many suggestions and tips and really material um, um, ideas you gave to maybe other people that want to do similar studies, so similar applications in different contexts and for different research questions. And I was struck in particular by this situation that all the people that have done photogrammetry or other digital imaging methods on site have to deal with, that you only have one day, you only have one shot. So if you want to talk a little bit more about ways to, let's say, minimize the risk of failure when you only have one day. So what are the things that you can do to, hopefully make sure that, you don't have to come back in like 10 years, because next time that you will be allowed, it will be in 10 years. So what are your strategies?
I would love to speak to that. And it's because I have myself been in several different situations where I've had the complete opposite of what I experienced for this trip, where I did come in with one day and I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. It was, earlier stages in my career, I'll say, where I was, a little bit more naive about what would happen, and basically ended up with unusable material. And like you said, in some cases, you can't go back. You have to do what you can then with the material you have. You have to hope that they'll allow you to come visit again. And I also, from a practical standpoint, our museum friends, it's a lot for them to have to host you. They have to have security, conservators, curators come take care of you essentially for the day. So it's a lot for everyone involved. But what I've learned, the best thing to do is to go in with a clear plan and backup equipment. So in terms of a clear plan, before going into this project at this point in my career, I knew exactly, what I was looking for. I chose this object not because it's my time period of interest, which it's not. It's my time period of interest is earlier, but because it represented this ideal piece where I could then, work with other objects, having, a case study like this. So I knew that's why I wanted the object. I knew that I had, from something, like 9:30 to 4:30. And so I tried to schedule out nearly hour by hour. Of course, it's not going to always be perfect, but the more that you have planned out, the better you can course correct as time goes on in the day. And like I said, extra batteries. I use a Nikon, a DSLR camera. Cell phone cameras, smartphone cameras are also really great. So if something happens, and a lot of us in ancient history, we're not independently wealthy in most cases, and I don't mean to say that you will have access to 2 digital cameras, but if you do, bring them both. If not, be prepared to use your cell phone to at least not render the day completely useless. And even, again, with just all of your different material, like for the RTI, we needed this reflective sphere, bringing backups of those, things like this. I think that really helps. And I read a lot of articles of people who had done previous studies that were similar to what I was looking at doing. And I think that also helps you prepare for what you might expect to find. We were even on site. We brought our laptop, and we're running models while we were there. So that's another reason that if you can take a research partner, somebody can be running models to make sure there's no holes in your mesh, for example. Or, when your camera flash, when the Bluetooth, we had like a Bluetooth flash separate from the camera. Sometimes it didn't go off. Sometimes it went off incredibly bright and it washed out the whole object. You can sort of make up for that. But yeah, so I hope that some of those things were helpful, but scheduling out for sure.
Yeah, thank you. That sounded very, very sensible, and it's a little bit the fun of it as well. I mean, it's
Mhm.
infuriating, but it's also a bit of the adventurous side of
Yes.
it. Yes, Gabby.
Well, while we're talking about this sort of practical side of things, I had a very similar question, but it was sort of the opposite question, which was that when we're talking about photogrammetry of objects that we have control over, we often say, and I'm thinking, pedagogically here, we often say to people we're training, if something goes wrong and you move the object, or you go away and it didn't work and you come back, you have to start again from scratch. You have to take all the photos again from scratch because you've moved it, and whatever's happened. And I'm wondering if you had taken all those photographs of that object, and just because it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon and the way the windows are facing in Texas, you get a lot of bright sun on that side. But the photos of the other side of the object were perfect. If you did have the opportunity to go back there 3 months later when the sun wasn't so bright, and that meant the photos on the other side were not as good, do you think there would be any problem with combining photos from 2 different trips like that, given that the object's not going to move, right?
As long as you use the same camera and the same lens. I have run, again, in the past, I've been in situations where different cameras were used on the same object, and these were put together. But and what I've learned is photogrammetry is super accurate. In fact, even without markers and even with combining these photos. So I think the best case scenario is that you would come back with the same lens and the same camera. And you could essentially do it seamlessly because especially if it's on display and it has not moved even a millimeter, right? It's just staying in the same spot. I myself, for the Amenhotep statue that we just talked about today, would love to go back and account for some of the light changes that were unexpected. And in fact, in that morning with all of the natural light, there was a huge thunderstorm all morning. So it was super dark. And then all of a sudden it cleared up completely and was very bright. And that was hard for us to course correct. So hopefully that kind of answers that question.
I guess the only difficulty thinking out loud now is that you'd have to be very specific about putting the markers in the right places again.
So now that you said that, I think you, actually, that's a really great question and something that I haven't thought about completely, because once the markers, even if they're just a millimeter off, it's not going to detect them properly. So it'd almost be better to not try to put markers back in and see if when it runs, if you get the traces of the markers, which, that might happen. In fact, when I ran this model, I cleaned it up got rid of all the extra geometry for the presentation, but there was so much additional data that was captured in my photos that I had essentially the entire museum was modeled out because it ran so well. But I wouldn't put markers back on, I think is that is a problem. And if you need them throughout the whole thing, I think you would have to start over and just move quickly or as quick as possible.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from YouTube. I'm gonna read them aloud for you, Kylie, and if Gabby puts them on the screen, we can all see them. So from Jeffrey, he's asking, what is the context of the Museo Egizio statue? Do you think you could link the Kimball Museum example to perhaps a single event of recarving?
That's a great question, Jeffrey. So the context of the Museo Egizio statue actually also comes from the Karnak precinct, from the Temple of Mut, at least from, I pulled this object because I've known about it, but I haven't done extensive research on it. But just from the museum information, it actually comes from the same context, at least when it was finally excavated. And one of my future avenues of research actually is perhaps linking this scenario to not a single event, but a corpus of statues that were reused in connection. Now, this is very Egyptological or Egyptologically specific to the King's Hebsed festival, where a bunch of statues, Karnak temples, the entire Karnak temple precinct is ginormous for those who aren't Egyptologists, statues everywhere. And it seems like perhaps he was taking specific ones as a part of his, statue program for his Hebsed festival. now for those watching, and if people are watching it later. Again, this is just an errant thought. It's an early thought. It hasn't been researched, so take it with a grain of salt. But really great question.
Thank you. And we have one more from NW that is thanking you for your lecture. How do you use the black disk shown as the equipment for structure from motion? I'm not sure I remember that, but you probably do.
I think for the SfM, it's probably the markers that were shown because they were just images of the image of the marker. So I apologize. That was probably my fault for not explaining those well enough when the image came up. But those are the targets. Now, these specific targets I use come from Agisoft Metashape Pro. It's specific to the Pro version, which I fortunately had access to through my institution. And then you can use those, and then Agisoft Metashape Pro will then, once you run the model, it can detect the markers and you can put measurements that way. You don't have to use those markers if you don't have access to them. There's a bunch of different ways that you can make this work. I know offhand that the Metashape Pro is over $3,000. I myself just have the standard version on my own computer with a student discount. I know we don't all have access to that. But what you can do is use different markers that you yourself pick out. You have to make sure you measure, preferably usually in centimeters is better or is best. So then you can have a millimeter count as well. And you should have, 3 different markers, set up those measurements. And then when you import it into something like MeshLab, which I showed, it's a little bit complicated, and I'll say it as briefly as possible, but they essentially have a measuring tool, and it'll give you an arbitrary number like 0.02. That is then your ratio that you use. You have like the measurement of the object itself, your reference markers, and you can do some mathematics in order to get a general sort of different measurements on the object. So I know that was convoluted, but it can be done outside of just using the Pro markers.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, Gabi.
The markers presumably also help you if your object has, for example, rotational symmetry or some areas that are similar. It helps the software to detect the same part of the object as in the photograph, right?
Oh, surely. I, in most cases, haven't had to deal with objects like that, but I can imagine, depending on what object you're using, this would be really helpful for the software. Yes, exactly, to have outside reference points for stitching the photos. You're absolutely right.
Cool. Maybe we have time for one last question. If I don't see one popping up in the chat, I'll ask it.
Okay.
Okay, I win. No, actually, I will take advantage of your art historian knowledge instead of your technical one this time. I see that Sebastian also wanted to say something, but I will have to wait now. You said that the reason for reuse were not always, let's say, economic. That sometimes they were political, which, I've seen also how much that particular statue traveled. That, I mean, taking it from one place to the other cannot be that economical. So clearly there is something else. So if you could just, expand a little on these other reasons, because, I mean, saving on materials is, very straightforward. But if you could say just a few words more about the other reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. So like was just mentioned, of course, there's the economic aspect. And I certainly am interested in times when there's contexts of scarcity, where you have to employ these different material adaptions, and then that ultimately leads to these technological innovations. So it's really, really interesting. But in other cases, like we were talking about with that colossal statue we looked at earlier on, might be politically motivated for one, it could just be, it could be sort of practical. So with Ramses II, there's arguments about, what the economic situation was during his reign. He reigned for decades and decades. So surely it changed. But part of it could be sort of like what I discussed briefly a minute ago, where it could be for a particular, he has this particular event or festival taking place, and there's already a bunch of statues that exist ready for him to use. And instead of expending resources on quarrying new stone and creating these new statues, for the king, he technically, in a perfect ideological sense, he owns everything. And all the statues of his predecessors are statues, of him. So he just updates it so it can communicate to the audience a particular message. Sometimes statues are usurped because essentially they might want to erase their predecessor from history, or one of their predecessors from history. And it could be motivated in that way as well. Additionally, ideologically, you might reuse something because you want some of that. For ancient Egypt, you're going to have some of this like magic, imbued within the object already, and you want to benefit from that. So it's so context specific, but there's so many different ways that reuse can be interpreted, and that's why it's so interesting. But yeah, hopefully that was answered the question.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much. And I'm going to read Sebastian comments. Some basic principle as having a scale in a photograph and turning that photograph into a one-to-one image. I think it was referring to the measurement and the targets that you were discussing before. And he's also saying, thank you for the practical application, parallel use of multiple forms of computational imagery has tons of potential as we work all the permutations. Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you also for waiting for me before.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for those comments. That is definitely true. And it's funny, I'll say briefly, I first and foremost am like an Egyptologist and art historian, and the informatics and computing is like the side hobby. So I am not a super expert. I use it in a very specific way. So it's useful to get comments from people who might use this type of this methodology in their daily work as well. So yeah.
Great. I think that if we don't have any last question from Gabby, we can say thank you to Kylie, and thank you for this very, very interesting talk. Thank you to all the people that watched it live and asked questions. And thank you in advance to the people that will watch it in the next days. The video is archived at this address on YouTube, so you can watch it as many times as you want in the future. And as we said, this is the last seminar for the regular summer series, but we will have more seminars in the coming months. And the next one up is on September the 10th, so save the date, when we will be talking about leveraging non-named entities in Coptic antiquity. So enjoy the rest of the summer and your holidays if you're going on holiday. If you're coming back to work, it's okay. I feel you. I'm doing the same. And see you all on September the 10th. Thanks again, Kylie. Bye-bye.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Yeah.